A 3-year-old girl walked up to the most dangerous man in Seoul and took his tattooed hand. "Sir," she whispered, her voice a small flame in the damp terminal. "Are you lost too?" Ji-hoon's phone was vibrating against his thigh. A rhythmic, violent demand. 3 lieutenants were waiting in a warehouse across town, their blades thirsty, expecting him to give the order for a purge. A name on a list was supposed to be erased before the sun hit the Han River. Ji-hoon looked down at 2 small, soft fingers wrapped around his scarred knuckles and, for the first time in a decade, he silenced the phone. Incheon Station at midnight had the pulse of an exhausted beast. Trains exhaled iron-scented steam, and the winter air cut across the platform like a serrated blade, forcing every traveler to tuck their chins and hurry as if stillness were a sin. Ji-hoon was the only one not moving. He sat at the edge of the bench, a monolithic figure in black silk, the edge of a dragon's tail climbing above his collar like a warning. His face was a mask of cold stone, his eyes those of a man who had traded his soul for power and forgotten where he'd buried the receipt. He wasn't waiting for a train. He was waiting for the darkness to consume him. Then the yellow coat cut through the gray. April didn't wander like a lost child. She moved with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity. Chin up, green backpack bouncing, beads clinking in her hair like a tiny melody. She was the only warm thing in the entire frozen station, and she walked straight toward the coldest man in it. She stopped, studied the ink on his neck with the raw honesty of the innocent, and reached out. "Sir," she said, calm as a still lake. "Are you lost as me?" The vibration against Ji-hoon's thigh was a rhythmic snarl, persistent and demanding. It was the digital heartbeat of a world that didn't allow for pauses, a world where silence was interpreted as betrayal. Inside his pocket, the screen flickered with a single name, a man who was supposed to be dead by dawn, and the impatient queries of lieutenants who lived and died by Ji-hoon's clock. He didn't move. His elbows remained anchored to his knees, his gaze fixed on the wet, shimmering tile of the platform. Beside him, the air seemed to hum with a different frequency. April didn't wait for him to speak with the anxious desperation of the lost. She waited with a terrifying, serene patience. She hoisted herself onto the wooden slats of the bench, her small green backpack bumping against the backrest with a soft thud. As she settled, the colorful beads in her puff buns clinked together, a bright, percussive sound that felt violently out of place against the low groan of the idling locomotives. "My mama says when you're lost, you have to find a lighthouse," April said, her voice small but sturdy. She swung her legs, her yellow shoes flashing like beacons against the dark shadows beneath the bench. "Are you a lighthouse, sir?" Ji-hoon finally shifted. The leather of his jacket creaked as he turned his head, a movement so slow it looked painful. He looked at the girl, then at the hand she had finally released. His skin was a map of ink and old scars, a history of violence etched into his very pores. He felt the phone buzz again, the 3rd missed call. In the syndicate, 3 missed calls usually preceded a funeral. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the device. With a deliberate flick of his thumb, he didn't answer. He turned the ringer to silent and placed the phone face down on the bench between them. The black glass of the screen reflected the flickering fluorescent lights above, looking like a dark pool of water. For the first time in 15 years, the cleaners were being kept waiting for a toddler in a yellow coat. "I am not a lighthouse, little one," Ji-hoon replied. His voice was a low rasp, and used to the gentle cadence required for a child. It sounded like gravel shifting under a heavy tide. "I am the thing the lighthouse warns people about." April tilted her head, her wide eyes searching the hard lines of his face. She didn't flinch at the darkness in his tone. Instead, she leaned in closer, the scent of rain and strawberry shampoo drifting from her toward him. She reached out and tapped the dragon tattoo that spiraled up his neck, her touch light as a feather. "You have a dragon," she whispered, her awe genuine and unafraid. "Dragons aren't bad. They just have to protect the treasure. Is that why you're waiting? Are you guarding the station?" Ji-hoon felt a strange, sharp ache in his chest, a phantom limb of a conscience he thought he had successfully amputated. He looked out at the station, seeing it through her eyes for a fleeting second. It wasn't a cold, iron trap. It was a kingdom that needed a guardian. Beyond the steam, He caught a glimpse of a shadow moving near the far kiosk. A man in a tailored overcoat who shouldn't have been there. The hunters were already looking for him. Yes, Ji-hoon said, his jaw tightening as his professional instinct merged with a new, inexplicable urgency. I am guarding, but we cannot stay on this bench. The dragons have to move if they want to find what's missing. He stood up, his tall, black-clad frame casting a long shadow over her. He held out his hand. Not the one covered in scars, but the other palm open. April didn't hesitate. She slid off the bench and wrapped her small fingers around his. The clink of her hair beads was the only sound as they stepped together into the gray fog of the terminal. The terminal was a cavern of echoes, but as they walked, the space between Ji-hoon and the child felt like a vacuum of terrifying silence. He led her toward the edge of the east corridor, his eyes scanning the periphery with the mechanical precision of a predator. He was counting exits, measuring the gait of every commuter in a trench coat, and watching the reflection in the polished glass of the closed shops. The shadow he had seen earlier was gone, which was worse than being watched. It meant the hunt had transitioned from observation to interception. Wait, April murmured, her small shoes skidding slightly on the damp tile. She pulled against his hand, not with defiance, but with a sudden, urgent focus. Ji-hoon stopped, his body instantly shielding hers from the main thoroughfare. He crouched down, his black silk trousers pulling taut, his gaze never leaving the crowd even as he addressed her. We need to keep moving, April. I have the map, she insisted. She reached into the pocket of her yellow coat, her brow furrowing in concentration. She produced a piece of paper, folded so many times the edges were soft and fraying. She smoothed it out against her knee, presenting it to him with the solemnity of a general sharing a secret intelligence report. My mama made it, in case the pigeons took me too far. Ji-hoon took the paper. His fingers, heavy with the weight of gold rings and old sins, felt clumsy against the fragile sheet. It wasn't a map of streets or subway lines. It was a drawing, a series of landmarks rendered in soft, confident strokes. There was the flower kiosk, the clock tower, and a small, crooked bird. But it was the style that stopped the air in Ji-hoon's lungs. The way the ink bled at the corners, the specific cross-hatching of the shadows. It was a visual signature he had spent 4 years trying to scrub from his memory. He looked at the bottom corner of the drawing. There was a tiny, stylized mark, a symbol of a flying turtle. The blood in his veins turned to liquid ice. For years ago, in a rain-drenched alleyway in Amsterdam, he had been sent to erase a woman who had seen the wrong side of a ledger. He had stood over her, his silenced pistol heavy in his grip, looking into eyes that refused to blink. She hadn't begged. She had simply looked at him as if she could see the boy he used to be before the syndicate took him. He had fired into the brickwork behind her head, told her to run, and filed a report that claimed the job was done. He had signed her death warrant with a lie to give her a life. He looked from the drawing to the girl standing before him. The roundness of her cheeks, the steady, unafraid light in her eyes. She was the living proof of a mercy he had never allowed himself to name. Is that her? April asked, pointing to a figure drawn near the edge of the paper, a woman with cloud hair and round glasses. Do you know where she is now? Ji-hoon's grip tightened on the paper, the edges crinkling. The mission he had been assigned tonight, the purge his lieutenants were calling about, wasn't a random hit. The syndicate had found the discrepancy. They hadn't just found a witness. They had found his betrayal. I know her, Ji-hoon whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. He wasn't just looking for a lost mother anymore. He was looking for the only evidence of his own humanity, and the men in the black suits were already closing the circle to make sure he never found it. I know exactly who she is. The weight of the realization pressed against Ji-hoon's chest, heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He folded the fragile map with hands that had suddenly begun to feel like they belonged to a stranger. He couldn't afford a moment of shock. In the world of the syndicate, realization was often the second to last thing a man felt before he was silenced. He straightened his back, the polished black of his tailored shirt catching the harsh light of the terminal. His eyes, sharp and predatory, didn't scan the crowd anymore. They dissected it. 20 yards away, near the bank of ticket kiosks, a man stood too still. He was dressed in a dark overcoat, his posture rigid, one hand resting in a pocket that held too much weight. A scout, Jihoon's own men. They were no longer waiting for his call. They were hunting for the discrepancy he had become. April, he said, his voice dropping into a low, controlled hum. We're going to play a game. It's called being a shadow. April looked up, her beads clinking as she tilted her head. Shadows are quiet, she whispered, her eyes widening with the thrill of a secret. The quietest, Jihoon agreed. He didn't pick her up. To carry her would be to mark himself. A man in a black suit carrying a child in a yellow coat was a silhouette that screamed for attention. Instead, he kept his hand firmly anchored to hers. She was his tether to the mundane world, the only thing keeping him from looking like a target. To a casual observer, he was a father guiding a slow-moving toddler. To the scouts, he was a ghost hiding in plain sight. He steered her toward the crowded center of the terminal, merging with a group of exhausted travelers hauling heavy luggage. He used the rhythm of April's smaller steps to dictate his own, forcing his long, aggressive stride into a docile, wandering gait. Every few seconds, his phone buzzed in his pocket, a relentless, electronic ghost. He ignored it. Each vibration was a bridge burning behind him. He spotted the second scout near the departures board. The man was young, someone Jihoon had likely trained, his eyes flicking across the faces of the commuters with professional coldness. Jihoon didn't look away. He knew that the moment you avoid a hunter's gaze, you confirm you are the prey. Instead, he leaned down as they passed, pretending to listen to something April was saying, his tattooed neck shielded by the collar of his jacket and her small, vibrant form. The contrast was his only armor. The scouts were looking for a high-ranking enforcer, a man who radiated authority and violence. They weren't looking for the man who let a 3-year-old in a bright yellow coat lead him toward a flower kiosk. Is the shadow man over there? April asked, pointing a small finger toward the very man Jihoon was trying to avoid. Jihoon gently lowered her hand, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The shadow man is everywhere, April. But as long as you hold my hand, we're invisible. They slipped into the narrow passage behind a row of vending machines, the air growing colder and smelling of damp concrete. Behind them, the station hummed with the sound of his world closing in. Ahead, the yellow of April's coat was the only light left in the dark. He wasn't just hiding her anymore. He was hiding the part of himself that had dared to let her mother live. If they were caught now, the list would be finished, and the light would go out forever. The passage behind the vending machines led them toward a cluster of small, late-night stalls that clung to the edges of the terminal like barnacles. The air here was thicker, saturated with the scent of roasted chestnuts and sweet batter, the smell of a world that functioned on simple hunger rather than complex debts. Jihoon slowed his pace, his eyes still darting toward the reflections in the chrome pillars. They needed to disappear into the mundane, to become part of the background noise of the station. April's pace faltered as they passed a stall decorated with fading stickers of cartoon animals. She stopped, her gaze fixed on a row of golden-brown pastries shaped like fish. My mama says that when the tummy rumbles, the brain can't think, she whispered, looking up at him with a hopeful, tired honesty. Jihoon glanced back at the main hall. The scouts were repositioning, their movements becoming more frantic as they realized their target had slipped the immediate net. He looked at the stall, then down at April. A normal man would simply buy his child a snack. A normal man wouldn't be calculating the ballistics of the storefront's glass or the thickness of the wooden counter. Wait here, he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He stepped toward the counter, his presence immediately cooling the air around the elderly vendor. The woman looked at his tailored black shirt, then at the intricate ink climbing his neck, and her eyes widened with a flicker of ancient, instinctive fear. Jihoon reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing past the cold weight of his silenced weapon to find a roll of bills. As he reached out to take a warm, paper-wrapped pastry, he saw them, his hands. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the stall, the scars across his knuckles looked like deep trenches, and the tattoos of dragons and serpents seemed to writhe against his skin. They were hands designed to break, to pull triggers, and to signify a terrifying authority. Now, they were tasked with holding something fragile and sweet, His fingers began to tremble. It was a microscopic shake, invisible to anyone but him, but it felt like an earthquake in his bones. He was a man who could hold a sniper rifle steady in a gale, yet the weight of a fish-shaped pastry was making his grip fail. He was performing a fatherly task with the hands of a monster, and the dissonance was shattering. "For the little one?" the vendor asked softly, her fear receding as she watched him struggle with the simple act of taking the change. Ji-hoon didn't answer. He couldn't. He took the pastry and turned back to April. He crouched down, his movements stiff, and held it out to her. The warmth of the food seeped through the paper, a sharp contrast to the cold iron of the station. April took it with both hands, her face lighting up with a radiance that made the fluorescent lights above seem dim and sickly. "Thank you, Dragon Man," she said, her voice muffled by the first bite. She reached out and patted the back of his trembling hand, her touch grounding him, pulling the vibration out of his muscles and back into the earth. For a heartbeat, the station, the scouts, and the looming purge vanished. There was only the heat of the bread and the small, rhythmic clinking of hair beads. He was no longer an enforcer. He was a man buying a snack for a girl in a yellow coat, and for that single, fleeting moment, he wasn't lost. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The reprieve of the pastry was shattered by the screech of iron on iron as a southbound express groaned into the station. Thick plumes of white steam billowed from beneath the undercarriage, curling around the pillars and swallowing the platform in a blinding, artificial fog. Ji-hoon stood, his body tensing into a defensive coil. In the shifting white mist, the world became a landscape of silhouettes and uncertainty. "Mama!" April's voice chirped, sharp and hopeful. She didn't wait for him. She darted toward the edge of the steam, her yellow coat a frantic flicker of light against the gray. Ji-hoon moved after her, his hand reaching out, his heart hammering against his ribs. He caught her shoulder just as a figure emerged from the veil of vapor. The woman was thin, her green coat damp from the mist, clutching a notebook to her chest as if it were a shield. Her hair was a wild cloud, and her round glasses were fogged. But as she wiped them away and her gaze locked onto April, the desperation in her face fractured into a sob of pure, jagged relief. "April!" she cried, dropping to her knees. But as April threw herself into her mother's arms, the woman's eyes drifted upward. They traveled past the small yellow coat, past the scuffed tiles, and settled on the man standing like a monolith in the shadows. The air in the station seemed to flee. Recognition didn't arrive as a flicker. It struck like a physical blow. The woman's breath hitched, a strangled sound dying in her throat. She didn't see a savior. She saw a ghost. She saw the man from the Amsterdam alleyway, the one with the cold eyes and the silenced barrel, the man who had officially erased her from existence 4 years ago. Her arms tightened around April with a sudden, protective violence. She began to scramble backward, her heels clicking frantically against the floor, her eyes wide with a terror so absolute it made the previous 4 years of hiding seem like a dream. To her, this wasn't a chance encounter. It was the closing of a trap. The debt she thought had been forgotten had finally come to collect, and the man who had spared her was here to finish the job. Ji-hoon remained perfectly still. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even move his hands from his sides. He simply watched her, his face a mask of tragic clarity. He saw the way she looked at his tattoos, the way she searched his expression for a sign of the mercy he had once shown, finding only the grim reality of the black suit he wore. The silence between them was an ocean, filled with the things they both knew. That he had lied for her, that his lie had been discovered, and that the men currently circling the station were the consequence of that one moment of humanity. "Vera," he said, the name a low, rasping ghost of a sound. The sound of her name on his tongue made her flinch. She looked at April, then back at him, her lips trembling. She was a woman who had built a life on the edge of a grave, and now, she realized the grave had been waiting for her all along. Behind Ji-hoon, the steam began to dissipate, revealing the distant, sharp silhouettes of the men in dark overcoats. The recognition was complete, silent, and utterly terrifying. The hunter and the prey had found each other again, and this time, the station was breathing with the intent of a cage. The cold draft of the station swirled between them, carrying the scent of ozone and the distant, rhythmic thud of a closing security gate. Vera remained frozen on the tiles, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches, her eyes darting toward the shadows where Ji-hoon's world was beginning to bleed into her own. She saw the ink on his neck, the sharp, tailored lines of his suit, and the absolute stillness of a man who lived within the eye of a storm. To her, he was the personification of the end. But April felt none of the history that weighted the air. She looked at her mother's trembling form, then up at the silent man who had bought her a pastry and guarded her through the fog. With the uncomplicated wisdom of a child, she saw only two people she cared for standing on opposite sides of a canyon. Slowly, April reached out. She didn't let go of Vera's hand, but she extended her other arm, her small, steady fingers reaching for Ji-hoon. She didn't grab his palm or his wrist. She found two of his fingers, the ones scarred from years of gripping steel, and wrapped her hand around them with a firm, grounding tug. The impact was silent but seismic. Vera flinched, her gaze dropping to where April's small hand acted as a bridge between her daughter's innocence and the man she feared most. The sight was a violent contradiction, the soft, yellow sleeve of April's coat resting against the black silk of a killer's sleeve. In that single point of contact, the three of them were tethered. The woman who had been spared, the man who had lied to save her, and the child who was the living result of that lie. Ji-hoon felt the heat of April's touch move up his arm, settling the frantic, predatory rhythm of his heart. He looked down at the two fingers she held, then at Vera. He didn't move to pull away, nor did he move closer. He simply stood as a pillar, allowing the child to anchor him to a reality that didn't involve lists or purges. "He's okay, Mama," April whispered, her voice a calm ripple in the dark. "The dragon is guarding us." Vera looked into April's eyes, seeing the absolute, unearned trust there. Then, she looked back at Ji-hoon. The terror in her expression didn't vanish, but it shifted, evolving into a desperate, calculating hope. She saw that he wasn't moving toward her with the intent of a hunter. He was standing between her and the terminal entrance, his body angled toward the distant silhouettes of the men in overcoats. He wasn't there to collect the debt. He was there to pay it. In that moment, the physical link April had created became a moral one. Ji-hoon realized that he could no longer separate his violent past from the future he had inadvertently created in Amsterdam. By holding April's hand, he wasn't just hiding. He was declaring a side. The two fingers she held were no longer meant for a trigger. They were an anchor to a life he had never thought he could own. "We have to move," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to settle the air. "Together." Vera looked at the two fingers April held. Then slowly, with a hand that still shook, she stood up. She didn't let go of April, and April didn't let go of Ji-hoon. They stood in the center of the platform, a strange, impossible chain of survival, ready to move into the dark as one. The amber glow of a single maintenance light was the only thing keeping the shadows at bay in the abandoned corner of the West Terminal. They had slipped through a heavy fire door, entering a quiet lounge where the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the silence of a day already ended. Outside the frosted glass, the station hummed with the muffled boots of men who were losing their patience. But inside, the world had shrunk to the surface of a low, wooden table. Between them sat an old checkers set, its board warped at the edges and its pieces worn smooth by years of forgotten hands. Vera sat in the corner, her back to the wall, her eyes never leaving the door as she clutched her notebook like a talisman. Ji-hoon, however, was anchored to the low chair opposite April. The contrast was a sharp, jagged truth in the dim light. A man whose life was measured in casualties, sitting across from a child who still believed in the fairness of games. April moved a red piece with a decisive clack. She didn't look at the board with the calculating coldness Ji-hoon used to map a city. She looked at it with a fierce, protective focus. Ji-hoon moved a black piece, intentionally leaving a gap in his defense. He was watching the door, his mind already calculating the distance to the service elevator, when April stopped his hand with a soft tap. "You're letting me take it?" she whispered, her brow pulling into a line of serious concentration. "That's not how you play." Ji-hoon looked down at his scarred knuckles. "In my world, April, sometimes you lose pieces to stay in the game." April shook her head, her beads clinking in the quiet air. She moved her piece back, resetting the line. My mama says that's not right. She says if you lose a piece, you don't cry. You just protect the king. Because as long as the king is safe, the story keeps going. The words landed in the room with the weight of a decree. Ji-hoon looked at the board, then at the small, vibrant child in the oversized coat. For 15 years, he had been the one sacrifice was built upon. He had moved people like pawns, discarding lives, including his own sense of peace, to serve the hierarchy of the syndicate. He had believed the king was the organization, the power, the faceless men who sent the vibrating commands to his pocket. But as he watched April carefully move a red piece to shield her back row, the realization shifted the very foundation of his soul. The syndicate wasn't the king. Power wasn't the king. The king was the thing that was innocent enough to believe a dragon could be a lighthouse. The king was the small, breathing life that had turned his world of shadows into a spectrum of yellow and red. She was the one piece on the board that could not be lost, the only one that justified every other sacrifice he had ever made, including the lie in Amsterdam. He looked at the door, where a shadow flickered across the frosted glass. The scouts were close. He reached out and, instead of taking one of her pieces, he moved his own black stone to sit directly in front of hers, forming a wall. You're right, Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, iron-firm vibration. We protect the king. Vera looked over from the corner, her eyes meeting his. In that shared glance, the fear in her expression finally settled into a grim, resolute understanding. They were no longer running just to survive. They were guarding the only light left in the station. Ji-hoon stood up, the checkers forgotten, his body positioned between April and the door. The game was over, but the protection had just begun. The heavy fire door of the lounge groaned as Ji-hoon pushed it open, stepping back into the vast, echoing lungs of the main terminal. The air here was colder now, smelling of old iron and the inevitable approach of morning. Platform 7 was a narrow finger of concrete stretching into the dark, where the final southbound express sat idling, its engine a low, rhythmic growl that vibrated through the soles of their shoes. Go, Ji-hoon said. His voice was no longer a rasp. It was a calm, steady command that brooked no argument. Vera hesitated for a heartbeat, her hand tightening on April's. She looked at the service stairs, then back at Ji-hoon, her eyes searching his face for the man she had met in Amsterdam. She saw the dragon on his neck, the sharp, tailored silhouette of his suit, and the absolute, terrifying peace in his gaze. She understood then that he wasn't just directing them to a train. He was directing them to a life he would never see. April didn't pull away this time. She looked up at him, her hair beads catching the flickering light of the platform. She reached into her pocket and pressed a small, sticky candy into his palm. A final silent offering from the king. Don't be lost anymore, Dragon Man, she whispered. Ji-hoon closed his hand around the small sweet, the sugar warmth a stark contrast to the cold weight of the world. I'm not, he said. He watched them move, the vibrant yellow coat and the hurried green one, disappearing into the steam of the open train doors. As the doors hissed shut, the sound of heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed from the North Passage. Ji-hoon didn't reach for the weapon tucked into the small of his back. He didn't retreat into the shadows of the maintenance alcoves. Instead, he turned and walked toward the center of the platform, stepping directly under the cone of a single, brilliant spotlight. 3 men emerged from the fog. They were dressed exactly like him, all black suits, sharp features, and the clinical stillness of professional erasers. These were the men sent to replace him, to finish the list, and to rectify the error of his mercy. They stopped 10 feet away, their hands resting inside their jackets, their eyes locked on the man who had been their legend and was now their target. Ji-hoon, the leader said, his voice as hollow as the station. The report was reopened. You have a name on your list that was never erased. Ji-hoon stood his ground. He didn't look like a mafia boss anymore. He looked like a man who had finally put down a burden he had carried for 15 years. Behind him, the train began to move, the slow, mechanical chug of the engine marking the distance between the innocent and the damned. The list is finished, Ji-hoon replied, his voice carrying across the iron arches with an unshakable finality. He didn't draw a blade or a gun. He simply stood in the light, his hands empty at his sides, his body a solid, unmoving wall between the hunters and the tracks. He was the gatekeeper of a secret legacy, a shield for a child who believed turtles could fly. As the tail lights of the train vanished into the tunnel, Ji-hoon closed his eyes and breathed in the cold, winter air. For the first time in his life, he wasn't waiting for a command or a kill. He was simply right where he was meant to be. He was home. The morning in the coastal city of Busan arrived not with the screech of iron on a track, but with the rhythmic, salt-crusted sigh of the tide against the harbor walls. In a small, sun-drenched apartment above a quiet flower shop, Ji-hoon stood at a narrow wooden counter, the smell of brewing coffee replacing the phantom scent of ozone and gunpowder that had haunted his lungs for decades. He moved with a different kind of stillness now, not the frozen tension of a predator, but the easy grace of a man who no longer had to watch the door. He was dressed in a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink that still spiraled across his forearms. The tattoos were a part of him, like scars from a war he had survived, but they no longer felt like a brand. The mail arrived with a soft slide through the floor slot. Among the local newspapers and utility bills was a single postcard, its edges slightly frayed from a journey across oceans. Ji-hoon set down his cup, his fingers, once trembling at a food stall, now steady and sure as he picked it up. He didn't need to look at the postmark to know where it had come from. On the front was a hand-drawn image in vibrant, wax crayon yellow. It was a turtle, its shell decorated with star stickers, soaring high above a field of clouds. In the corner of the drawing, a small, familiar signature was etched in uneven, proud letters. April. He turned the card over. There were no long explanations, no details of their hidden lives, just a single sentence written in the same steady hand he had seen 4 years ago in an Amsterdam alleyway. The sky always knew we could fly. Ji-hoon walked to the window and looked out at the street below. A group of children were walking to school, their laughter rising through the air like a melody. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had once held a silenced pistol and a fish-shaped pastry. They were the same hands, covered in the same intricate black and gray patterns, but the heaviness was gone. The weight of the syndicate, the burden of the lost years, and the cold iron of the station had all dissolved into the morning light. He reached into a small ceramic bowl on the shelf and pulled out a faded, sticky candy wrapper and a crumpled drawing of a cloud-haired woman. He placed the new postcard beside them, a final piece of a puzzle he had spent a lifetime trying to solve. He wasn't a mafia boss, a legend, or a ghost anymore. He was simply a man who had stood in the light when it mattered most. As he watched the sun reflect off the water, Ji-hoon realized that the little girl in the yellow coat had been right all along. He hadn't just been a dragon guarding a treasure. He had been the treasure all along, waiting for someone to be brave enough to find him. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. The world was vast and full of shadows, but for Ji-hoon, the waiting was finally over. He wasn't lost. He was home, and for the first time in his life, the sky was his too. The story of Ji-hoon and April serves as a profound reminder that redemption is never a closed door, but a path waiting to be stepped upon. It teaches us that mercy is the ultimate subversion of power. To spare a life requires more strength than to take one. Ji-hoon's journey reveals that we are not defined by the shadows we have inhabited, but by the light we choose to protect when the world grows cold. True courage is found in the willingness to become a shield for the innocent, even at the cost of one's own safety. Ultimately, the narrative whispers a gentle truth. No one is ever truly lost beyond rescue. Sometimes, all it takes to find our way home is the reach of a hand that does not know how to be afraid, and the realization that our humanity was never gone. It was simply waiting to be seen. We have come to the end of this story. Do you believe no one is ever truly lost? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the Cinem channel. Thanks for watching. Sit back, relax, and let me tell you another story.